Good day. Before I proceed with the matters which I will discuss in this video, just a brief announcement about tomorrow. Briefly, today, after I finish this video, I'm travelling out of London to keep a long-standing private appointment. I will be returning to London late in the afternoon or early evening tomorrow. Now that may mean that I may not be able to do a video tomorrow. I hope I will, but perhaps I won't. And if anybody looks out for a video tomorrow, well, that's the reason. I would much prefer to be in London today on the day of the Queen's funeral, but unfortunately, calendrical timetable decisions taken many weeks ago have determined otherwise. To proceed, today I'm going to be focusing on a press conference that President Putin of Russia gave at the summit, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization summit in Samarkand, in which Putin addressed head-on some of the criticisms that have been made about the special military operation in Ukraine, gave some hints about what may be coming, and also perhaps dealt with some implicit criticisms of himself. I'm also going to just touch on briefly certain other diplomatic matters. An interesting meeting, an important meeting between Putin and Modi, and the way the British media have covered it, and also certain events which point increasingly towards an intensifying Syrian-Turkish rapprochement. But before I do that, and as I traditionally do now, I will touch on the situation in the battlefields on Ukraine. Now, I have to say that today there is actually not especially much to report that is in any way particularly exciting, at least not on the battlefields. We've seen more Ukrainian attempts to try to break through Russian defenses in Kherson region. Every one of these attempts appears to have been a failure. It does now seem as if that Ukrainian bridgehead across the Ingulets River, a place called Andreevka, may be in its final days. Apparently the pontoon bridges were washed away after the dams were destroyed and the current of the Ingulets River grew stronger. And it does seem as if the Russians have tired of the game they've been playing with this bridgehead, allowing the Ukrainians to advance into it, shelling them massively with artillery and airstrikes, driving them back, allowing them to come back in, repeating the cycle, carrying out massive destruction to the Ukrainians, who have persisted with this bridgehead despite achieving no gains from it. But apart from the fact that Ukraine has suffered losses, severe losses, there's been no fundamental change of the situation on the Kherson battlefields. Further east, yesterday, there was a sort of flurry of rumors that the Russian forces had withdrawn from the eastern half of the city of Kupiansk on the Oskol River, and there were some very excited comments about this which appeared on the threads of some Russian Telegram channels and in some Ukrainian Twitter feeds and things of that kind. Well, I'm not entirely sure what exactly did happen. It does seem as if there might have been some kind of a Ukrainian attack on Kupiansk, on the eastern part of Kupiansk, beyond the Oskol River. But by this morning, it's clear that eastern Kupiansk is very much still under Russian control. Maybe there was a small reconnaissance group that crossed the Oskol River, perhaps on dinghies or rafts or boats or something of that kind. Maybe they wandered around eastern Kupiansk, which is lightly defended, and took some photographs of themselves before retreating back across the river. Or maybe something of a greater significance happened there. Maybe there was some kind of a battle or firefight. But whatever it was, that particular incident has ended. And as I said, as of this morning, as of the time of making of this video, Kupiansk is back under Russian control. Now, this does bring me to a specific point I do want to address. There's been repeated suggestions, there's been commentaries going back all the way to April and May, that this area of Kharkiv region is somehow essential to Russia, for the Russians, because it's a major transport artery. Russian forces in Donbass and Lugansk supposedly receive much of their supplies through this transport artery, which passes through eastern Kharkiv region, and that the loss of Kupiansk, the loss of Izium and Balakleya is somehow going to complicate Russian supplies. And I was really rather bewildered to see the British Ministry of Defence this morning in a military summary repeating that story. I'm going to say straight away that I think it's all nonsense. I use that word straightforward. I could use an even stronger word, in fact. And I would suggest that people actually look at a map. Firstly, the two regions that make up Donbass, Lugansk and Donetsk regions, both border upon Russia. And they don't just border upon Russia, they border upon Rostov Oblast, one of those two regions of Russia, along with Voronezh, which is also nearby, by the way, which Liz Truss, in her meeting with Lavrov a few months ago, appeared to believe had once been part of Ukraine. Anyway, they're not part of Ukraine. Rostov and Voronezh are very much part of Russia. And Rostov is a big city of over 1 million people, and it is the unofficial capital. In fact, it is in fact the official capital of southern Russia, of the Russian Federal District. This whole area is heavily industrialized, it's agriculturally rich, it has massive transport links, and it borders on Donetsk and Lugansk. I am absolutely sure that the vast bulk of Russian military supplies to Donetsk and Lugansk go directly there from Rostov region, from this important city of Rostov-on-Don. I think this idea that the Russians have been sending some supplies through Kharkiv region, well, perhaps they've sent some supplies at various times. Now, I certainly don't believe it is the major supply route for the Russian armies and in Donbass. When I say the Russian armies, I mean the Russian army itself. I mean also, obviously, the Lugansk and Donetsk militia, and I mean other groups like the Wagner formation and the Chechen forces. All of them are there in force. So anyway, to repeat, I am sure that the real supply route goes through Rostov-on-Don. In fact, as somebody who followed the fighting in 2014, the earlier period of conflict in Ukraine that took place in 2014 and 2015, I remember that at that time the Ukrainians and the Western powers were so concerned about the scale of the Russian supplies that were coming into Donetsk and Lugansk from Rostov, that the entire Ukrainian operational plan at that time, which by the way failed disastrously, was to try to circumvent Donetsk city, gain control of the frontier, the border with Russia in these regions, and thereby cut off supplies to Donetsk city and to Lugansk, which were at that time controlled by the militia. This, by the way, for those who are interested, led directly to the Battle of Ilovaisk, where the Ukrainian army suffered a catastrophic defeat. So this whole story of, this area, Kupiansk, the area of Kharkiv region, all that place up in the north being critical to Russian supplies, I am sure is completely wrong. And any reflection on the history of this conflict and any glance at a map, even the kind of maps which I'm able to see, shows that this simply cannot be true. By the way, on this topic, we are getting more and more information, and this is this time confirmed by photographs and pictures and films, that Russian reinforcements are rolling in to northern Lugansk region, obviously to counter any conceivable Ukrainian attacks launched against northern Lugansk region by the Ukrainian forces in Kharkiv region. So just wanted to set this out, just in case some of you have been hearing about how the fall of Kharkiv region, the recapture by Ukraine of Kharkiv region, how Kharkiv region is somehow important to Russian supplies in Donbass. It isn't, it never has been, and this whole story is a fantasy. It's something that people have conjured up in order to explain why Ukraine has devoted so much time and effort to fighting the Russians there. Anyway, to move on, the other places, Zaporozhye in the south, much discussion and debate about a possible Ukrainian offensive there, maybe one to recapture the Zaporozhye nuclear power station. So far, nothing of that sort has happened. Nobody quite knows why, but it's been pointed out that the longer Ukraine delays the launch of this offensive, the more difficult it becomes. Russian forces are reinforcing in this area fast, and of course the climatic conditions make such an offensive, which would have to be across the Dnieper, that they make that increasingly difficult. Anyway, we'll see what more happens shortly, whether there is ever a Ukrainian offensive in Zaporozhye or in Ugledar, from the southern Donetsk city of Ugledar, which a lot of people were again talking about. Nothing like that at the moment. There's a lot of news about advances by the militia along the ring road opposite Donetsk city, about the fortifications, the Ukrainian fortifications being taken apart one by one. There's been bitter fighting there. There was a Ukrainian attempt apparently to recapture Pesky, that big fortified village, whose fall has severely weakened the entire Ukrainian position opposite Donetsk city. That Ukrainian counterattack was defeated with heavy loss of life, apparently. And the Wagner group continues its steady suffocation of the Ukrainian garrison in Bakhmut, where heavy fighting is still going on. It is in that area, in Donbass, that the fighting is at its most intense, and where, if you're talking about fighting, infantry fighting, ground fighting, that has been going on at its most intense level throughout the war, throughout the summer, into the autumn, and it continues like that to this day. And it is where, by the way, I suspect Ukraine has been suffering its heaviest casualties, except for that brief period early in September when Ukraine launched its ill-starred attempt to capture Kherson. Anyway, that's all I'm going to say about the events on the battlefields, because I'm now going to go and discuss Putin's press conference. And it's important to reiterate that this press conference, which took place in Samarkand, was a press conference between Putin and the Russian media. It was entirely the Russian media. The Western media do not seem to have been invited. In fact, I'm not even sure whether any of them were present in Samarkand at all. But anyway, that's what it was. Just the Russians, just the Russian media. And I'm not going to read the entire press conference, though it was relatively short, but I will deal with those aspects specifically which deal with the war in Ukraine and the fighting in Ukraine. And that was where Putin got the most pointed questions from the Russian media which were there. Now, some of you who assume, maybe people who assume that Putin is some sort of autocrat or dictator, may be surprised by how pointed these questions were. I should say that the entire press conference was televised. The Russian people will have seen it. I've said that at some point Putin needed to come out and give an explanation about what was going on after the events in Kharkiv. This press conference did that. And of course, it could only have done that if he was asked proper questions about what happened. And he was asked those questions, and he did answer them. So I'm going to focus on that part of the press conference. And by the way, I'm going to do so reading from the Kremlin's own transcript of the press conference. I cannot emphasize this point too strongly. You will find lots of excerpts of things that Putin is supposed to have said in the Western media. Nearly always they're taken out of context, and in a few cases, I have to say this, they're straightforwardly invented. If you want to get a flavour of what Putin actually says, if you want to get a reliable sense of what Putin says, you have to go to the Kremlin's own website. Sometimes some people I know go to various websites where they read translations that the website providers have provided of Putin's comments. I would advise against doing that. Russian is an extremely subtle and nuanced language, and the Kremlin, when it very carefully translates into English Putin's words, is extremely careful to give his words in English the same nuance that he sought to give when he was speaking in Russian. So you go to the Kremlin website, you don't just get a translation, an accurate translation of what Putin said. You also get a much closer feel, a sense of what he said. Literal translations of another language can be misleading. Anyway, without further ado, I will go to what was said about the special operation in this press conference. And it is important, and it does give us a good insight into where things are going. And I'll start with the first question on this topic and then Putin's answer. Question. This question is certainly worrying very many people in our country. People have already developed certain concerns over the course of the special military operation in Ukraine. We are increasingly seeing strikes, raids, and acts of terror, even on Russian territory. We are hearing all the time very aggressive statements that the final goal of Kiev and the West is Russia's disintegration. Meanwhile, many think that Russia's response to all of this is very restrained. Why is that? Now, Putin answers, and this is his answer. There is nothing new about this. Frankly, I find it even a bit strange to hear your question, because Western countries have cultivated the idea of the collapse of the Soviet Union and historical Russia, and Russia as such, its nucleus. I've already cited these statements and studies by some figures in Great Britain during World War I and after it. I cited excerpts from Mr. Brzezinski's writings in which he divided the entire territory of our country into specific parts. True, later he's changed his position a bit in the belief that it was better to keep Russia in opposition to China and use it as a tool to combat Russia. It will never happen. Let them address their own challenges as they see fit. But we are seeing how they're handling them, and most likely they're doing harm to themselves in the process. The tools are no good. So let's pass that. Putin is perfectly familiar with all the commentary about Russia, the West wanting to divide Russia up, to break it up. He knows all about that. He says this has been a long-standing Western plan. He talks about the British talking about this from the era of the First World War. He refers to Brzezinski as well. Note that he conflates the Soviet Union with what he calls historical Russia, which is an important point. So historical Russia was the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union and historical Russia were one and the same country. And Russia is its nucleus, which, if you think about it, might one day mean that once Russia is stabilized, perhaps historical Russia might start to consolidate around it. We shall see. It doesn't actually say that, but perhaps that thought is at the back of his mind. But anyway, he knows that this is the West's objective, and he says it won't succeed. He also says that any attempt by the West to play Russia off against China won't succeed either, and that the West trying to do these things, that's going to work against the West's own interests. Anyway, he then continue with his comments. But they have always been seeking the dissolution of our country. This is very true. It is unfortunate that at some point they decided to use Ukraine for these purposes. In effect, I'm answering your question now, and the conclusion suggests itself. We launched our special operation to prevent events from taking this turn. This is what some US-led Western countries have always been seeking, to create an anti-Russia enclave and rock the boat, threaten Russia from this direction. In essence, our main goal is to prevent such developments. Now, that links the special operation with the plan, the West's plan, to engineer the breakup of Russia. That says that for Russia, the special operation is an existential matter. That also says that Putin and the Russian government, the Russian authorities, cannot allow the special military operation to fail. Whatever setbacks there are in the process, Russia has the resources to make it succeed. We've discussed this many times on this channel, on the Duran as well, with Alex Christoforou, in other places, on live streams. Putin is saying clearly that because this is an existential operation for Russia, because the West has been trying to use Ukraine to engineer the collapse of Russia, Russia, with its resources, will eventually make sure that this operation succeeds and this war is won. And to my mind, that tells us that the ultimate outcome of this special operation will eventually be a Russian victory, or something which perhaps could best be defined as a Russian victory. And then he addresses the question about restraint. With regard to our restrained response, I would not say it was restrained, even though, after all, a special military operation is not just another warning, but a military operation. In the course of this, we are seeing attempts to perpetrate terrorist attacks and damage our civilian infrastructure. Notice the careful use to perpetrate terrorist attacks and damage our, which is to say Russia's, civilian infrastructure. Indeed, we were quite restrained in our response. Notice the use of the past tense. We were quite restrained in our response. But that will not last forever. Recently, Russian armed forces delivered a couple of sensitive blows to that area, and he's clearly touching on the Russian attacks on Ukraine's energy system. Let's call them warning shots. If the situation continues like that, our response will be more impactful. So, the attacks on the civilian infrastructure were sort of warning shots, though that doesn't mean they didn't have other purposes as well. If attacks on civilian infrastructure within Russia continue, then the Russians will react even more forcefully than they have up to this moment. But here comes what is, in my opinion, the single most important section of comments Putin made over the course of the entire press conference. Terrorist attacks, notice the word terrorist, are a serious matter. In fact, it is about using terrorist methods. We see this in the killing of officials in the liberated territories. There's been, in fact, assassination attempts. The Attorney General of the Lugansk region was recently assassinated, and there have been other assassination attempts as well. And there was an attack on the administrative building in Kherson region. By the way, I think very unwisely, the Ukrainian government has actually taken credit for these attacks. I think it was a serious political mistake which will lead to consequences. But anyway, to continue with what Putin says, we even see attempts at perpetrating terrorist attacks in the Russian Federation, including, I am not sure if this was made public, attempts to carry out terrorist attacks near our nuclear facilities, nuclear power stations in the Russian Federation. Now, nuclear power plants in the Russian Federation. Now, I have not been aware of any attempts to do damage, to create incidents in nuclear power stations within Russia itself. But Putin has said that they have been happening, even though they may not have been reported. And he qualifies these attacks as terrorism. And he then goes on to say, I'm not even talking about the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant. So when he says attacks on nuclear power stations, he's not talking about the attacks on the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant, which, by the way, as I discussed in my video yesterday, have now been admitted even by the New York Times, even by US officials, to have been carried out by Ukraine. Putin is talking about Ukrainian attacks, or attacks sponsored by the Ukrainian government on nuclear power stations within Russia itself. And Putin is categorizing these as acts of terrorism. He says, we are monitoring the situation and we will do our best to prevent a negative scenario from unfolding. We will respond if they fail to realize that these approaches are unacceptable. They are, in fact, no different than terrorist attacks. Now, to my mind, that is the clearest indicator that the topic of extending the remit of the special military operation, upgrading it to a counter-terrorist operation, is now not only under serious debate in Moscow, but is probably about to happen. Putin is saying here that Russia has been very restrained. It has not attacked civilian infrastructure. Ukraine is attacking civilian infrastructure, not just in the territories which Putin says have been liberated in Ukraine, places like Donetsk, Lugansk, Kherson, Zaporozhye, and the rest, but in Russia itself. He says that there have even been sabotage attacks on Russian nuclear power stations. Now, let me say straight away, I don't know whether what Putin says about these Ukrainian alleged attacks on nuclear power stations, whether that has really happened. But in practical terms, and for the purpose of understanding what is going to happen next, I don't think ultimately it matters one way or the other. Putin is clearly signaling here that before very long, perhaps already, a decision has been made in Moscow to upgrade this special military operation in Ukraine into a counter-terrorist operation. Now, to repeat again, that doesn't necessarily mean that there will be large numbers of men mobilized in Russia. That doesn't mean mass mobilization of Russians into the military. It may mean the call up of some reservists, but as I've discussed in previous programs, the United States does that with the National Guard when it has to, when it sends troops to Iraq and whatever. So that wouldn't be such a huge thing, but I'm not even sure that it means that. What it means is that if the special military operation is upgraded in that way into a counter-terrorism operation, then that will give the Russian military the freedom to attack civilian infrastructure, to do other things, perhaps to target Ukrainian military leaders and security officials, perhaps even conceivably, ultimately, the political leadership, though I think that will need a specific green light from Putin himself. But to do all of those things which up to this moment in time, they have not been permitted to do. And it seems to me that we are now very close to that point, perhaps even there. Then there is a discussion about the draft security guarantees that Ukraine was talking about the other day, which I'm not going to waste time on. Putin claims that he hasn't even read these draft security guarantees. They essentially ask the West to commit to World War III with Russia in defense of Ukraine, something which I would have thought would alarm the Western powers rather than persuade them to agree to these security guarantees. But anyway, there's a discussion about that, which I'm going to skip. We then come to the next question, and it's the following. Could you please share your opinion on the special military operation? Is it necessary to adjust the plan? Now, I said that it's important always to go to the Kremlin's website to get the proper feel for what the Kremlin wants us to take from this press conference. And notice the careful use of the word plan. So Putin replies, no, the plan will not be adjusted. The plan. Now that leaves open the upgrading of the special military operation, but into a counter-terrorism operation, because the plan will not be adjusted, but the terms of reference might be. Anyway, to continue, the General Staff takes real-time decisions in the course of the operation, and some are considered a key, the main goal. The main goal, notice again, the main goal, not the only goal, the main goal is to liberate the entire territory of Donbass. This work continues despite the attempts of the Ukrainian army to launch a counter-offensive. We are not stopping our offensive operations in Donbass itself. They continue. They continue at a slow pace, but consistently and gradually. The Russian army is taking more and more new territory. I must emphasize that we're fighting not with the full army, but only with contracted forces. Again, note, with contracted forces. He's not saying that the entire Russian professional army is fighting in Ukraine. He is saying that the part of the Russian army which is fighting in Ukraine is drawn from its professional part. To continue. But of course this is linked with certain personnel parameters and so on. This is why we are not in a rush in this respect. But essentially, there have been no changes. The General Staff considers some objectives important and others secondary, but the main task remains the same and it is being carried out. Some objectives important and others are secondary. Liberating Donbass is important. It's the main goal, not the only one, the main goal. Others are secondary. Holding on to Kharkiv region was secondary, so the Russians withdrew from it because it didn't matter. It didn't matter to the same degree that accelerating, intensifying the advance in Donbass mattered. Now, Putin did also say a few things about the Ukrainian counteroffensive. And he was here, shall we say, extremely uncomplimentary, to the point of being, shall we say, almost cynical about this. He said the following: I have something to add to my answer to the first question. You said that we are seeing activity here and there, but Kiev has announced that it has launched a counteroffensive, an active counteroffensive operation. Let's see how it unfolds and how it ends. And then he also says that the Ukrainians, he also said elsewhere in the press conference that the Ukrainians have dropped any idea of negotiations and they're now talking about pursuing victory on the battlefield. And he responds to that, let them try. They're just now trying to do this with the counter-offensive. Let's see how it ends. I mean, this is Putin at his most mischievous. He is basically saying Ukraine has launched a counter-offensive. It's not going to go well for them. Whatever they think they may be achieving for the moment in Kharkiv, ultimately, this is going to end badly for them. And here I'm going to say something, by the way. There's been a very interesting discussion, a very good, interesting article by the American scholar Gordon Hahn, one of the best scholars on Russian-related and indeed Ukrainian-related affairs, in which Gordon Hahn has discussed a paper published by no less a person than Ukraine's military leader, General Zaluzhny. And Gordon Hahn makes the point that if you read this article carefully, it is now unequivocally the case that General Zaluzhny is not in favour of these counteroffensives, that his priority, and this is essentially taken from General Zaluzhny's own published words, was to hold back forces, husband them, build up his reserves, build up a force of 20 brigades, re-equipped with Western weapons, perhaps launch some kind of offensive in 2023 when this mighty army of 20 brigades was eventually built up. Instead of which, unsurprisingly perhaps, President Zelensky and his officials, surrounded by his, advised perhaps by his Western advisors, by his British and American advisors, has launched counteroffensives now, which are achieving, well, they've recaptured some territory in Kharkiv region, but everywhere else they don't appear to be achieving much, but they are essentially throwing away those very reserves that General Zaluzhny has said that he wants to build up. So it's an interesting and revealing contrast in views. Zaluzhny wants to remain on the defensive, build up his forces in the rear. Zelensky wants to launch these counteroffensives for their morale effect, and he has achieved something on that front, but he's also frittering away the reserves that Zaluzhny wants to husband. And you can see from these rather sneering comments that Putin thinks that Zelensky's approach is clearly the wrong one, that these offensives are going to play into Russia's long-term advantage, that the offensives will eventually fail, and that at the end of it, Ukraine will have thrown away its reserves. Now, he doesn't spell it out. As I said, he's deliberately mischievous and enigmatic. The actual television film, the actual film when Putin makes these comments, shows him looking almost bemused, looking almost chuckling. I mean, perhaps I'm reading a little more into this than what I've said, but what Putin said. But I don't think actually it's particularly difficult to figure it out. Anyway, that's not the entirety of the press conference. The press conference then ended with a long, angry debate about the fact that the food supplies that Ukraine has been allowed to export have not been going to the countries in the global south which need the food. They've been going to the European Union, and that the European Union has reneged on all its promises to release fertilizer and food, Russian fertilizer and food. And none of this can be any surprise to Putin at all. I'm not going to discuss that. That's all been discussed by me in other places. What I will say about this is that I've recently seen a breakdown of Ukraine's exports, such as they now are. And it's now clear that to the extent that Ukraine is exporting anything at the moment, it is almost entirely food products. Such foreign currency as Ukraine is earning from its exports entirely comes from exports of food, which, if you are to believe Putin, go entirely to the European Union. So what is our ultimate take from all of this? Firstly, Putin is completely unfazed by these Ukrainian counteroffensives. The Kharkiv counteroffensive doesn't impress him in the slightest. He is confident that the Russian General Staff, knows what it is doing. It is adjusting its priorities. It gives its main focus to the liberation of Donbass, liberation as Putin would call it, which is proceeding steadily with, the events on the Donetsk Ring Road, in Bakhmut city and all that. So Putin is not concerned about these counteroffensives, but it is highly likely, given all that's been happening, real, or shall we say, sort of things that Putin is talking about, the attacks on Russian nuclear power stations, perhaps, that's spun. I'm not somebody who will say that Putin isn't capable of making things up sometimes. Though on general, I have to say, I found him factually a very truthful man. But, he's a politician after all. But anyway, regardless of that, Putin is clearly signalling that Ukraine, its conduct, some of which it has unwisely admitted to, is setting up a situation where before very long the Russians are indeed going to upgrade the terms of reference of their military operation in Ukraine from a special military operation into a counter-terrorist operation. Now that may happen very soon. The Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu is due to visit the Russian Parliament, the Duma, on Monday, and it could be that some announcement is made then. We will see. But at the moment, all of the indicators are pointing in that direction. These attacks on Ukraine's energy infrastructure, on the dams and all of that, which up to now, by the way, the Russian Ministry of Defense have been silent about. They are partly warning shots, as Putin says, but clearly, from the tone of his comments, they point to something bigger coming. In other words, an upgrade of the current operation from a special military operation with its very restricted terms of reference into something where the terms of reference are loosened to allow attacks on infrastructure and perhaps even attacks on individuals. So that's the essence of Putin's comments. I find them very interesting indeed. I find that they're probably what most people in Russia were looking for at this particular point in time. And they do give us a very interesting insight into both what Putin himself is thinking and into the debates that have undoubtedly been taking place on the part of the Russian leadership over the last few days and weeks. Now, before I end this video, there's two topics I want to talk about, one of which is very important. In fact, they're both very important, but I'm going to devote more time to one than the other. The first is the meeting between Putin and Modi, the Prime Minister of India. And it's becoming increasingly clear that the relationship between India and Russia is now becoming increasingly important. From a Russian point of view, it's now second in importance only to the relationship Russia has forged with China. And it's important to say that both the Chinese and the Indians, far from being critical about the fact that the Russians are forging these links with each of these two countries, they seem to welcome the fact, even though relations between China and India have been, shall we say, tense, each of these two countries likes to have Russia, a good friend to each of them, maintaining its relations with both, the better to manage those tensions. Anyway, To proceed, the British media yesterday was back to its game of trying to make out that there were some problems in this meeting between Modi and Putin. You will remember that they tried to do the same thing about the meeting between Putin and Xi Jinping. They homed in on one word in the Kremlin's transcript of Putin's introductory words to Xi Jinping, the word concerns, to imply that the Chinese were in some way critical of Russia's actions in Ukraine. And in my last video, I went to some lengths to actually go through what the various readouts had actually said in order to show that this attempt by the British media to find these problems between the Chinese and the Russians over Ukraine was basically taking one word out of context and giving a spin on the whole discussion, which the actual full readouts and documents that came out of that meeting between Putin and Xi Jinping, that they simply didn't support. On the contrary, the meeting between Putin and Xi seems to have gone extremely well. Now, yesterday, the British were doing the same thing about the meeting between Putin and Modi. And the focus this time was on some words that were said by Prime Minister Modi over the course of his meeting with Putin. And these words, which appear on the Indian Foreign Ministry's website, and by the way, also on the Kremlin's website, are these. I'm going to take them from the Indian Foreign Ministry's website. Modi said, "I know that today's era is not a war." And it's been suggested, the British media have suggested, that this was a rebuke from Modi to Putin for the fact that Russia is conducting a special military operation, in effect, a war in Ukraine. But the reality is completely different. It is, in fact, the diametric opposite. Now, in order to show that this is so, I'm afraid I'm going to have to look at two entirely different readouts, the Russian readout and the Indian readout. Now, I say that because very, very unusually, the Russians have reported certain introductory words that Putin made, but in their readout, the Kremlin's readout, they've omitted some of Modi's words, though not these words. I know that today's era is not of war. Those words are in the Kremlin readout, but they've omitted some of the very warm words that Modi addressed to Putin personally, which are important. And the Indians, perhaps not surprisingly, this is much more common with readouts, have not included in their, which is actually a transcript, I should say, Putin's words, introductory words to Modi. I should say that in fairness, the Indians have provided a short readout of the entire discussion between Modi and Putin, but that's not particularly interesting or informative. I'm going to take it from the transcripts, the texts of what each country says the one leader said to the other. Now, I'm not going to read the entirety of these transcripts. I'm going to focus on the exchange, the actual exchange between Modi and Putin and Modi, which led to those words of Modi's. This is, "I know that today's era is not of war," which the British have homed in on. And then I'm going to read those words of Modi's from the Indian transcript of his words, which, interestingly or curiously, the Russians have not published. But anyway, let's go first to Putin's words. this is the actual words Putin addressed to Modi. And I should say that it was Putin who made the first remarks over the course of this conversation. So he made some said some very warm things about India, about Modi personally, about the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and all that. But then Putin specifically addressed the question of Ukraine. And these are the introductory words. He said the following. This is what Putin said to Modi. I know your position on the conflict in Ukraine and the concerns that you constantly express. We will do our best to make it stop as soon as possible. However, unfortunately, the opposing side, the leadership of Ukraine, announced that it was abandoning the negotiating process and declared that it wants to achieve its goals by military means, on the battlefield, as they say. Nevertheless, we will always keep you informed of what is happening there. Now, those are the words that Modi then responds to, which, as I said, have been quoted by the British. And this is the entirety of Modi's words, taken from the translation provided by the Indian Foreign Ministry. I know that today's era is not of war, and we have spoken to you many times on the phone that democracy, diplomacy and dialogue are such things that touch the world. Today we will get a chance to discuss how we can move forward on the path of peace in the coming days. I will also get an opportunity to understand your viewpoint. Modi is not criticising or rebuking Putin. Putin is telling Modi, look, I know you want a negotiated end to this conflict. I'm doing all I can. I'm open to negotiations. It's the Ukrainians who don't want to negotiate. It's they who are talking about victory on the battlefield. I sought negotiations, in effect, from the very first day when Russian troops entered Ukraine. We were offering to sit down and talk with the Ukrainians, and we came very close to a peace agreement. But it's the Ukrainians who are talking about achieving victory on the battlefield. And Modi is saying that that's wrong. The Ukrainians are in the wrong. What we should do is we should sit down and we should try and find a peaceful solution to this conflict through diplomacy and dialogue. Exactly what you, Putin, are telling me the Ukrainians are rejecting. And I find this concerning, but we're going to have a discussion about this, and you can explain to me exactly what is going on. So that's the discussion. If there is a rebuke here, as I said, it's by Modi to Ukraine, not to Putin. Now, I want to qualify that immediately by saying that Modi is also extremely careful. And these words are also, by the way, quoted in the Kremlin's website. Modi was extremely careful to take an outwardly neutral position on the war. He went out of his way to thank both Putin personally and Ukraine for evacuating Indian students from Ukraine at the start of the war. So he's tempering whatever implied rebuke of Ukraine he's making by those words, those other words, about the need to return to diplomacy by that statement of neutrality. But he is making it pretty clear that if it is indeed the Ukrainians who are not negotiating, and if it is indeed their Western backers who are encouraging the Ukrainians not to negotiate, then he thinks that that is wrong, and that they're pursuing a policy of war until total victory, which is not consistent with the principles of today's era. So, as I said, when you actually put these two transcripts together, you get a completely different understanding of this entire conversation. Now, Modi went on to say an awful lot more, and this I'm taking from the Indian transcript, and it is not from the Russian transcript. The Russians, someone in the Kremlin, decided to omit these words. I'm taking this again from the transcript of this discussion held, which is provided by the Indian Foreign Ministry. The relationship between India and Russia has deepened manifold. We also value this relationship because we have been such friends who have been with each other every moment for the last several decades, and the whole world also knows how Russia's relationship with India has been and how India's relationship with Russia has been, and therefore the world also knows that it is an unbreakable friendship. Whole world, unbreakable friendship. Personally speaking, in a way, the journey for both of us started at the same time. I first met you when you were working as the head of the Russian government, and I had started working as head of the state government. Today, it has been 22 years. Our friendship, and he clearly means our personal friendship, is constantly growing. We are constantly working together for the betterment of this region, for the well-being of the people. Today at the SCO summit, I am very grateful to you for all the feelings that you have expressed for India. So, Modi says, friendship between India and Russia is unbreakable. Anybody in Washington or London who thinks, or Brussels or Berlin, who thinks that it can be broken, is getting this completely wrong. And it isn't just the friendship between India and Russia which is unbreakable, but so is the friendship between Putin and Modi. A personal friendship which goes back to 2001 when the two men first met. At that time, Modi was not Prime Minister of India. He was Prime Minister of a state government and had, as my memory serves me rightly, had visa entry to the United States rejected because of his alleged involvement in a communal incident that happened in the Indian city of Ayodhya. So here we see Modi, far from making any rebukes to Putin, going out of his way to tell not just Putin but the world that India's friendship with Russia is unbreakable, no chance of India ever doing anything to Russia's detriment, and Modi's own feelings towards Putin and Putin's feelings towards Modi being ones of friends. Now, I said that there was another very important event that's come out of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization meeting. Now, that event is that President Erdogan of Turkey has now confirmed, apparently to the Turkish media, that if President Assad of Syria had attended the SCO summit in Samarkand, then Erdogan would indeed have met him. Assad didn't actually come. Perhaps he's not yet ready to meet with Erdogan, but it does look as if the rapprochement between Syria and Turkey is now moving forward at rapid speed. And we've been getting more and more reports that the chiefs of intelligence of Syria and Turkey are now meeting on a frequent basis and are having lots of discussions with each other. So clearly a summit meeting between the presidents of Syria and Turkey is in the works. Erdogan has made it clear that he's in agreement with it, and this, of course, will change the entire dynamics of the Syrian conflict. This long video has now continued for more than an hour. It always does when one has to pass documents. So I'm going to finish this now. I will briefly say that the Syrian-Turkish rapprochement is a game changer in terms of events in the Middle East. I will certainly be returning to it in future videos, just as I will also be discussing in more detail events at the Shanghai Cooperation Organization in videos which are to come. But anyway, at this point, I'm going to stop. I think I've spoken long enough. I hope you've taken some useful things from this video. In the meantime, please remember that you can chase us. You can find all my videos, all Duran videos, all Alex Christoforou videos on Locals, where, let me repeat again, I do live streams every Wednesday at 1400 hours Eastern Standard Time, 1900 hours London time. You can come, ask me questions on Locals. I will answer them either during the live stream or in a follow-up video. And also, you can find us on other platforms, Rumble, BitChute, ODYSEE, and of course Telegram. And if you want to support our work, you can do so by going to Patreon and Subscribestar. And you can also remember to go to our shop, get yourself the amazing things that you will find there, our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our sweatshirts, our t-shirts, all of those great things. And last but not least, if you've liked this long video, please remember to tick the like button and check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon, perhaps tomorrow, though perhaps not, as I said at the start of this video, but certainly I will be back soon. And have a very good day until then.